Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It's another Wednesday, which means it's stream time. So I'm happy to see everybody who is here now, and thank you to folks who are watching on the VOD later on. I want to begin by doing some shout outs as folks have. There's been some follows and some subscribers since the last stream. So, shouting out some folks here. Thank you to Maddie D Makes Games for the follow, as well as Blind Hero, Sistal1, Troud Lol, Charles Wotan, Huso101, Greg Malski, and Willy Boy 98. And then thank you to Donovan522 for the subscription on Prime, as well as to Magmalena for subscribing on Prime. And that's all of my kind of leet streamer like and subscribe administrivia. But it's all genuine. I'm very grateful to all the folks who have enjoyed my streams and wanted to kind of connect and chat here during the stream, as well as everybody who has been leaving great comments and questions on the YouTube archives. The YouTube is definitely the place to go if you're not able to join live, but you want to engage and chat and kind of hear back from me about any questions or things that you have. So I'm going to direct people that way just because I find that YouTube interface a little bit easier to deal with between streams. So that's all of this kind of stuff sorted. As you can see, I have my community gaming license disclaimer down here as a reminder. The streams that I do are not official, right? These are not kind of word of God or canon from Darrington Press. I am not the lead designer on Daggerheart. I was one of the designers. My credit is additional designer. So I have a lot of experience with the game and I have a lot of opinions about it. But when I'm streaming here, they're all just my opinions and my interpretation of the game. So this is a rulings not rules game, and so you get to make it your own. And if you have a different idea or a different approach to things than me, that's totally fine. You have to figure out what works for you and for your table. So all of that said, today we are talking about creating dynamic combats in Daggerheart. Basically, how I think about and how I approach creating combats that are going to be memorable, that have highs and lows, that have a feeling of intensity, that do what you want them to do in the story, right? Because not every combat has to do the same thing. And just some other stuff that I try to keep in mind when I'm thinking about prepping, and then especially when I'm running combats and action scenes in Daggerheart. A lot of this applies to other games as well, but I'm going to use the lens of Daggerheart because I know there's so much interest and there are folks who are curious and interested in what I have to say about this game in particular because of having spent a lot of time with it. So the good action scenes and good fight scenes is something that I have thought about and written about a lot in my previous life that continues, but I'm not focusing as much, right? I've been a professional author and novelist since 2012, right? My first novel came out in 2012. I had some short fiction published before then. And even before that, I did some media criticism, and action adventure films are one of my favorite genres. So this is a mode of storytelling that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and have a lot of opinions about. And so I'm excited to share some of those as they manifest in playing and running Daggerheart. So first, I want to start with some high-level philosophy stuff, right? Some of how I think about combat and action scenes in Daggerheart writ large. And the first big thing that I've kind of already tipped my hand on is that combat is part of how we tell the story. It is not an interruption of story or a digression from story. Combat scenes are a way of doing storytelling, right? Combat can give you characterization. Combat can raise stakes. It can reveal and change relationships between characters. There's a lot that you can do with combat and then with action scenes more broadly if you're keeping certain things in mind. And so those are things that I want us to be thinking about and keeping in mind when we are having this discussion now. I definitely want to shout out an essay that has had a couple of different forms. This is by John Rogers, who is the co-creator, I believe, of Leverage and then Leverage Redemption. John is also a big RPG fan, so there's a small chance that John is watching this. If you're watching this, John, I love Leverage. You do great work. Thank you. Also, thank you for this essay. It's called Don't Write Fight Scenes, or Don't Write Action Scenes, I'm sorry. Write Suspense Scenes instead, or it, like there's a few different ways of saying it, so apologies if I'm getting this wrong, because I'm not going to go find it right now. Otherwise, I'll get on a digression. The basic idea is that combat on its own is less interesting than when action is the grammar or the language being used to address or resolve a bigger sense of suspense or other conflicts, right? If you have a fight scene and what that fight scene does is a bunch of wolves attack you and they want to kill you and eat you, and you want to not be eaten, but there isn't a lot of other sense of motivation. The wolves are hungry. You don't want to get eaten. If you then have a fight scene where the major uncertainty is, will any PCs die? That may not be as interesting as if there is an intersecting element of motivation or uncertainty or some other conflict. An example, I believe, that's in the essay is if you have protagonist A and they are chasing antagonist B, and then they fight. That's not as interesting as antagonist B has a briefcase with important information, and the protagonist is chasing the antagonist, and they want the information. So they want to catch the antagonist, and they want the information. Then in that scene, you can make the protagonist choose between capturing the antagonist and getting the information, right? What happens if the antagonist, while they're running, drops the briefcase? Do you go after the briefcase or do you go after the antagonist? That can be a really interesting choice. So that framing of thinking about action as a way of resolving other dramatic questions is a great place to start with Daggerheart, right? We know that Daggerheart advertises as a game where combat plays a notable role, right? Dynamic combats. It's like in the copy. So that's what we're trying to go toward. How are we going to do it? Quick pause for thank you to GH Lello or Galelo for the follow. GHLEYO. Twitch names are wild and fun to try to pronounce. Obviously, one of the funnier things to do while watching Twitch is streamers attempting to understand how to pronounce various people's names. So you're enjoying that genre of Twitch content / video content right now. So if our action scenes, thanks for hanging out. If our action scenes are not just do the PCs die, but they are the PCs pursuing some motivation. It is a way for antagonists to reveal their motivation. It has the PCs and adversaries at cross purposes, or the adversaries in the scene are another group of heroes who are trying to get a magic artifact because actually this other country on the other side of the world is having a big problem that could also be addressed by the artifact that the PCs want. And unfortunately, both of them are on a timer. So what are you going to do about that? Well, maybe that becomes a fight scene, but that fight would be about resolving that set of conflicting motivations and objectives. So motivation and objective are, I think, really key elements for making scenes that are more than just choreography, right? If a scene does not have a strong sense of motivation and there's no real uncertainty, it can feel a little bit emptier to me, right? Again, this is just my opinion, but I bring that into how I think about Daggerheart. So I want combats that have some variety in objectives and are a way of manifesting or testing motivations. And I'm not perfect, right? There's times when there is a fight because it makes sense that there would be danger that emerges, and maybe in those situations the protagonist's, like the PC's objective is well, let's not die, and we want to keep going, right? So we want to be able to get through this scene, or it's we know that we have another fight ahead, so we're going to try to get through this as unscathed as we can. Well, that's a little bit more already than the question of do we die, right? Do the protagonists die? Can we get through this clean, right? Because we need to keep our resources and some of our abilities in waiting to use against what we know to be a bigger threat ahead, right? Then there's the resource management of the game comes into the fore, because you're thinking really closely about, do I want to go ahead and use this thing now, or do I want to try and get by without having to use this extra resource or this more powerful ability that costs resources? So that can be really handy. Flowing out of that, when you're prepping or like getting ready to have a fight scene or an action scene, it's really useful to think about, what is the scene doing in the overall story of the campaign, right? If Daggerheart is a game where we're focused on narrative and the overall dramatic arc of these characters and this party and trying to find out what happens to this world, a fight scene for just having a fight scene may not be as satisfying for you as the GM or for the players if this scene is introducing a new type of adversary, or it's establishing that a villain is really like a credible threat that the PCs are going to have to try to figure out how to deal with. If a combat shows escalation from a faction, right? There's this bandit group that the PCs clashed with, and now the bandits are ambushing the PCs at the PCs camp, and they have more powerful weapons than they did last time. Then that's escalation, right? The conflict might be more similar to a previous conflict, but how you're deploying it shows that there is movement and change in the story, in the world state. Combat may come from emergent conflict, right? You're having a conversation with an NPC, and they're not giving you the information that you want, and so you intimidate them, and they say, well, I won't be bullied, and they draw their weapon, right? And they're going to like fight to force you out of town, right? Maybe you're trying to intimidate a town sheriff, and the sheriff is not having any of it, probably because you failed the role, or the GM decided to spend fear to have the sheriff kind of escalate rather than back down. So that can be an emergent conflict. The thing it's doing in the scene is following with the kinds of consequences and results that you would expect from what has already been happening in the story, right? The escalation comes not because the GM says a fight scene goes here, but because the GM is thinking about the motivation of the characters and making a decision that either the PCs then respond to with combat, or that is an escalation toward violence. Another thing you can do with a scene is you can like just show that the PCs are overmatched, right? You introduce an antagonist that hits really hard, and then the PCs make a couple of rolls, and they're level 2 characters, and somebody gets like, oh yeah, I got a 17, and you say, that doesn't succeed. A 17 should probably succeed against most adversaries when you're tier 2. So that might be a way of communicating to the player characters, you don't want to be here, or this faction is bad news and you're maybe going to need more resources or more help to be able to take them on, right? There's a bunch of different things you can do with this. And the last big thing I want to kind of convey from my perspective on combat and action in Daggerheart is that combat is not a separate mode of play. If you're using maps and minis, whether that's in a VTT or in person, right, there may be a pause or a shift if you are moving into that space where we're attending more closely to who is where, keeping track of different actors on the scene. But mechanically, being in a fight scene and being in any other scene are not really different in Daggerheart, right? You can take damage in a scene that's not a fight. You can end up marking armor in a scene that's not a fight. You can certainly spend or be forced to mark stress in a scene that's not a fight. Some games have like a separate mode, right? We're going to roll for initiative. We're going to use this type of turn order that only applies in combat. Daggerheart doesn't really have that. What that means, and how I tend to run it, is that you can move in and out of combat really seamlessly because you don't have to do as much of a mode shift or like a register shift to move in and out of combat. And it means you can have things happening during a scene where combat is happening that are not combat, right? You could cut back and forth between here's 3 PCs over here having a conversation, and then one PC is in a different place having a fight. And then you can use like dramatic irony or uncertainty about timing to be like, oh, are the player characters going to realize or hear or find out that that one character is being ambushed in time? And you can move back and forth between those scenes. And because you're not having to use like a separate mode of play for combat, it becomes really easy to shift between different types of storytelling, different types of scenes, different registers of drama, without also then having a mechanical layer that you're switching in and out of. There's a story that I want to share from a home game that I play in. So shout out to my Chicago friends. I'm playing with them again tonight. It's great to have a Daggerheart home game where I am a player. So I get to enjoy it in a way that a lot of folks, or where I GM, right? I'm GMing for a variety of people. But in this game, I get to be a player and experience that side, which is really useful for me, both as just like a human who likes this game and for any like further Daggerheart stuff that I do. In this scene, the PCs saw like gray black smoke emerging from where they thought the town was. So they race back to the town. The town is in absolute disarray. There's like some kind of like foreign moss from another dimension that is like it trying to encapsulate and eat people. And there's a fire and some other stuff is going on. So one of the characters leaps into action, kind of jumping around the town to try to figure out what's happening, and then gets attacked by a bear-sized bush, right? Like an animate, hostile bush. For that whole scene, that one player character is just fighting the bush. Other player characters take attacks and make attacks during that scene. My character never attacked during that scene because the actions she took were, let's see if I can remember them correctly, try to identify where there might be civilians who are in danger, use nature's tongue to talk to that moss from another dimension, intimidate that moss into letting the person go that they had kind of their stranglehold on. And then maybe I made one other action, but what I didn't do was ever make an attack roll. So I was having like a social interpersonal negotiation scene and like a race against the clock, try to rescue civilians. That's all I was doing in that scene. And that was very satisfying to me. It was another way of interacting with a situation. And in that situation, there were actors, player characters, and antagonists via adversaries who were at cross purposes and were in a fight. I was in that scene and I was at danger, but I was engaging with it in a totally different way. And it worked really smoothly because Daggerheart's core system is the core system for everything, right? You make action rolls for all these things. There's very little difference between attack rolls and other action rolls in a lot of ways, right? The difference is you're going to do damage is really the big difference as I see it and as it applies here. And that was a great display and example of how Daggerheart's flexibility in how it thinks about action and combat and storytelling writ large gives you a lot of leeway and can be really satisfying to engage with and makes it easier to like pivot on the fly. I've had games and scenes where I was running Daggerheart where there's a fight is happening, and one player character says, no, we need to stop fighting now, makes a presence roll after describing kind of how he kind of makes this appeal to everybody to stop fighting, and he rolled really well. And so rather than saying, I mean, well, these adversaries are hostile, so maybe I'll mark stress, but they're not going to stop fighting, I decided that in that moment, because of the role and because of what I knew about these bandits' motivation, that we would stop combat. And that scene shifted from an ambush to a fight to a tense negotiation like that, which is really fun. So the next section that I have my notes on is preparing for these kinds of scenes and how you construct them. And then I've got a lot of stuff on like moment to moment tactics and techniques. And then there's some like potpourri, random miscellany that I just didn't, don't need to have that on the whole time, that I couldn't fit anywhere else. And so I just have like extras. As last week, my intent is to probably not go more than about an hour and a half, as that's around when, if I'm just talking, my voice starts to strain a little bit, and I want to take care of my voice. I've got a game tonight, as I said. Hello, the kids are asleep. This is a very fun emote that you have from Shadow 2335 Annie Rave. So good to see you. The Kids Are Asleep is a professional science fiction and fantasy writer, as well as an editor and a friend of mine. And so it's fun to be able to hang out and talk storytelling, because a lot of this, right, my philosophy on combat and fight scenes is my philosophy on storytelling, action, and combat, whether that is in RPGs or not. So the overlap is very strong. Going back to my outline, prep. When I'm building fights, if I'm trying to make a big deal out of the scene, I'm going to try to I'm going to pick adversaries from different types, right? In the game of Daggerheart, adversaries have different types: skulk, support, ranged, standard, minion, horde, and so on. If I try to name all of them, I'll probably forget something and then I'll feel silly. Different adversary types have different features. They have different strengths and weaknesses, and the book tells us that they are meant to do different things within a given scene, right? Or that they are designed to be able to do different things within a scene. If you have a scene where what you want is for the adversaries to try to keep the PCs distracted in order to sneak something past them, then you might think about, okay, do I want more minions to try to kind of keep the PCs hemmed in? Do I put a horde at a choke point to make it harder for the PCs to move past that horde enemy and intercept whatever the item is? Do I have the item carried by a skulk adversary who has some kind of like special stealth ability, or the ability to like move across the battlefield really seamlessly or more rapidly? What is this scene trying to do? What adversaries could I utilize, whether that is using them from the book or designing them on your own, right? Or using somebody's community gaming license, third-party material, however it is that you do it. It comes back to, what is the scene meant to do? Additionally, in any scene, you can have an environment block, right? The way I think about Daggerheart is that every scene has an environment. You just may not have established what that environment is mechanically, but there are going to be times when you need to be able to improvise, well, what's the difficulty of something here, and this relates to the environment itself. Then you're engaging with the environment framework as I think about it. You don't have to use an environment for every fight scene. You don't have to use an environment every time. You could use an environment. I like using them because I'm very fond of them. I think that using environments can help you ground a scene and make it feel like that scene is happening in a particular place with qualities of what it is like to interact in that place, right? Because those features, the passives tell you this is just what it's like to exist in this space. Maybe they change some rules, or they establish some ground rules. In the bustling marketplace environment, there's the feature that will let you get advantage on rolls by bribing somebody, right? That describes what it is like to engage and interact within that environment. And then actions are things that the environment can do, or that characters, in this case probably adversaries, can do through the environment or as the environment. And then reactions are the ways that the environment responds to things happening in the scene. Environments can synergize with adversaries in a big way, right? I have gotten a lot of use out of the tier 2 cultist adversaries and the cult ritual environment, right? Because those cultists are the perfect kind of adversaries in many cases to put into a cult ritual, and some of those features overlap. Some of them are a little redundant, because then the cultists can do some of that on their own without necessarily needing the environment, or you don't need the cultists to do it because it's in the environment. So sometimes you're going to end up with a little bit of overlap or some redundancy if you've got environments and adversaries that are really tightly aligned, because maybe they were designed to be modular. So they could do that thing that has the overlap separate from one another. Another thing that I think is great for Daggerheart action and combat scenes is you want to set up, or I feel like I want to set up the PCs to get chances to be awesome and to show off how cool they are, right? To get to use abilities that I know that the player likes using, or signature abilities, or to create and present an opportunity for the players to use new abilities, new spells, new domain cards, new subclass features, whatever, to use things they haven't gotten to use yet, right? We just leveled up. And so in that next combat, I'm going to look at the character sheets and I'm going to go, I definitely want to give this PC a chance to use this spell here. I'm not going to make it so that they have to use the spell as the only way to resolve the scene. I'm probably going to feel better if I just create that opportunity and then see if the player takes that opportunity, right? I want to give them chances to get to be cool. This is, for me, an expression of the principle of being a fan of the characters. In fantasy RPGs more broadly, there's this idea of shoot the monk, right? In D&D 5e, the monk class gets an ability that will let them deflect projectiles, right? Like, they parry it, or they catch it, or they knock it out of the sky. If you have a monk in your game when you're running 5e and you never shoot at them with ranged attacks, you're not giving them the opportunity to utilize that cool ability that they have, right? So that's the idea of shoot the monk. It is run your game in such a way that lets the players use the cool abilities that they have. That's how I think about it. Hi, Prince Justin. So those are my big thoughts on prep. If you've been playing Daggerheart and running Daggerheart, but just been engaging with the SRD, and you have access to the full book, I strongly encourage you to read the Running an Adventure chapter. Looking at the kind of the parallel section in the SRD, there's just a ton more guidance and support in the core book itself. So you can get the basic rules and all of the rules text in the SRD, but we put a lot of love into the main book. I feel like, I know I put a lot of love into it, and I feel like it's reasonable for me to say that everybody worked really hard on it without feeling like I'm speaking for anybody else. I'm very proud of the work that I did on it. I think it's a great book. If you are excited about Daggerheart, I would strongly encourage you to try to find, borrow, or get access to a core book. Maybe that's buying the Nexus version on Demiplane or something. I understand that because the game has been so successful, there's a lot of places where it's sold out. And so I understand that can be a bummer, but especially if you're running Daggerheart, the full book has a lot that I think will be helpful. to check out. So as I was doing my notes, I'm like, I know that this is in the core book. So I'm not going to focus on it a ton because it's already there, right? That guidance exists. And I don't know that in this stream, I'm necessarily going to say a lot that is different than what is already in the book. Because I think my perspective on how I want to do things aligns pretty closely with where the book ended up, kind of as a text in terms of the guidance it gives. So that is that. The biggest section, this is basically just the bread and butter, moment-to-moment techniques. What are the things I think about and the things I do during a combat scene? And throughout the stream, I've said like combat and action scenes. An action scene, or for me, a combat is an action scene with violence, right? An action scene could be escape the crumbling temple, right? Action is you need to move through a space. There is danger that relates to potential physical harm. I don't want to get too into the weeds on action scene versus combat scene, but just giving a little context on why I kind of say both or jump back and forth. When running one of these scenes, I would a thing that I try to keep in mind, right? And this is something that I work on on an ongoing fashion because I'm not perfect, right? I've GM'd for a long time, but I'm trying to always get better. And here I'm going to jump over to the version with the SRD in and show and highlight the GM moves, right? The full book has a lot more here with examples and a bunch of guidance. So I'll remind folks to take a look at that. But the SRD that we can look at here, there's a bunch of example GM moves, right? These are not the only GM moves that you can ever make, but they represent a pretty good range of action you can take. In a fight scene, spotlight an adversary happens pretty often, but what I try to remember and what I will encourage other Daggerheart GMs to try to remember and internalize is that this is not the only move you can make during a fight scene. Shift the environment is not the only other move you can make during a fight scene. Spotlighting an adversary might create or overlap with some of these other moves, but I wanted to step back and look at all of these moves within the mindset of how could some of these apply in a fight scene. GH Leo says, 100% agree, best practices, handy for any game, and still learning new ways to improve the table time. Thank you so much. I'm really glad that you like it. So we're in a fight scene, GM moves, show how the world reacts. The GM is kind of always doing this, right? You might do it through other moves, or a player character takes an action, you describe what that resolution is. The players are looking to you. If they don't immediately, if no one immediately says, okay, great, and now I want to do something, you might show how the world reacts to what has just happened, because one of the prompts where GMs are encouraged to consider making a move is when the players look to you for what happens next. Show how the world reacts it's a very versatile move as I think about it. That can be as straightforward as telegraphing an attack, right? Player character attacks antagonist A over here, and then you realize, this player character B over here hasn't had the spotlight in a while. So why don't I show how the world reacts and think about how what's happening over here could inspire an antagonist over here to telegraph or begin acting against this protagonist who hasn't had spotlight in a while. So then I, as the GM, am kind of setting up that player character to take the spotlight because I'm applying what is currently soft but could quickly escalate in terms of amount of pressure. And I'm kind of signaling to that player, hey, I'm going to set you up to take the spotlight here, or I'm telegraphing a threat, and if you don't do something about it, if nobody does something about it, then I'm probably going to want to follow through on it. Thank you for the follow, Fazakerly. Great names. Great names, everybody. Um, so show how the world reacts. Ask a question and build on the answer. This can be really fun as a way to like hone in on emotion in a fight scene, right? Like, how do you feel having just like been made to hallucinate some fear of yours, right? The player characters are all fighting a flicker fly, and the flicker fly use their feature that lets them kind of discover one of a character's fears, and then they do the hallucinatory gas that makes the character kind of face that fear. Well, one thing I could do as a GM, especially if like a player character gets a failure with hope, because we're invited to make softer moves on failures with hope than failures with fear. We're invited to make harder moves on results with fear. I might have my move just be, how are you feeling, right? Are you able to shake off that fear and that memory, or is it changing some of how you're thinking about what's happening? Or if you have like a friendly rivalry between PCs and one PC in that rivalry does something awesome, I might ask the other player character, how do you feel seeing your friendly rival have just been so awesome, right? Are you feeling like you need to prove yourself here? That ask a question and build on an answer, that type of engagement with a player character through talking to the player is one of my favorite things that I feel like I I learned to use more in my GMing because of playing and learning Power by the Apocalypse games. So I'm very glad that it ended up as like a notable example move in Daggerheart, because it's one that I really love. Prince Justin says, I definitely see notes of your theory and practice of GMing in this, both the SRD and what you were saying. Yeah, right. I feel like my approach is manifested in the book. My approach, I think, also overlaps broadly with how other people in the design team think about the game, which is part of why it worked, right? We had overlap in what we wanted in games. That's my experience of that. And thank you so much for the Prime sub, Fazakerly or Fazakerly. When I have wacky names, I try to like unpack like, okay, what is this? Is this like a player character name? Anyway, I could go down a rabbit hole, but thank you again for the sub. I really appreciate it. To not have the stream last forever, let's just pick up a couple more other example moves that we might use in a fight as examples of how we can avoid a combat scene, just be becoming a player character. I attack the skeleton knight. Cool, I hit, I deal 17 damage. And as the GM go, oh, okay, that's major damage. I mark 2 hit points. But you rolled with fear, so I get to spotlight the knight who then attacks you. I roll. Cool, I hit you. I deal 15 physical damage. And the player's like, wow, that's rough. I would take major damage, so I'm going to mark an armor. So I mark 1 hit point. One, we want to try and begin and end with the fiction, right? So we want to try to not get too far away from describing the individual attacks so that we can maintain our sense of an understanding of the specifics of the fiction, right? I like to not lose track of that. And if it's just attack back and forth, that can begin to feel a little bit like a slog. But what if the player character attacks the skeleton knight and then they do some damage but they get a success with fear? Rather than having the skeleton knight attack, I could say, I've grown weary of your trickery. And then the knight's eyes glow red and their mouth opens real wide and they howl an unearthly deep howl. And I decide to not just use a move to signal an imminent off-screen threat. I say, I'm going to spend a fear. And the next time anybody rolls with fear, a bunch more skeletons are going to show up. You can hear the clattering of bones from within the woods. Well, that's a pretty fun move, right? It is showing that there is future threat. It maybe is telling the PCs that they need to maybe step up what they're doing, Maybe it tells them, we got to take out this knight because the knight is the one that can bring in more skeletons. Right? It's communicating something different than just, here's how much damage the skeleton can do when the skeleton is attacking you. So that dynamism comes from variety, from a rise and a fall, from escalation. A great thing you can do in an action scene or a fight scene is make the PCs split up, right? You're fighting in a burning building, and one of the moves that I make is, cool, a ceiling beam falls crashing down between you, and if you want to get to where the other PCs are, you're going to have to make a pretty dangerous agility roll to get up and over that flaming beam without getting burned. Right? That is force the group to split up. Other things you can do that may come up in a combat pretty often is like clear an adversary's condition, right? I think it can be really fun to, when you're doing that, talk through what the fictional explanation for the adversary getting over the condition is, right? Is somebody helping them? Are they kind of refocusing? Do they take a moment to, put themselves put the fire out or something, right? I try to begin from the fiction and think about how could this adversary get over having been restrained by the player character in the story. Okay, I have that in mind. I'm going to describe it, and I'm going to reflect that in the mechanics by saying, I'm going to use this move to clear the adversary's restrained condition, right? And then I figure out whether I need to do more description to return to the fiction, or whether we're returning to the fiction by one of the players describing something that they do. Adversaries or other forces of antagonism in the story can also do some of these other moves, right? The antagonist or the adversary might be the person who uses a PC's backstory against them. I'm doing it as the GM, and I'm expressing it through the character. Or I might use a PC's backstory against them by asking a question and building on the answer, right? The stakes are high, but the technique I'm using is this. And so one move can kind of also have the shape of another move, but it's still the same move as I think about them. So, right, if you're using a GM screen, maybe you've got these moves up. If you're trying to practice this idea of thinking more expansively about what moves you make during a fight, maybe you want to put this list somewhere that you can keep in mind as a reminder to try to avoid just falling into a rhythm of attack, counterattack, attack, counterattack. Right, features on adversaries and environments will also help you with this because they give you different verbs that the adversaries can use and verbs that the environment can manifest to vary what is happening in the fight, right? Even the variance between the knight hits one person and the knight kind of spins their sword and then does a whirling slash that attacks everybody within very close. Even that is some variety, right? And then you can build on beyond that with greater variety. Okay, so now we're going back over here. Related to this, and a lot of these do flow in and out of each other because they're just kind of all in a big mishmash in my head, is make every move matter. This again for me is like a goal more than the floor, right? When I'm doing a fight, sometimes the thing that makes sense is this adversary takes the spotlight and makes an attack. But, and especially if I feel like there's been a little bit of back and forth, I might try to think about what other move could I make? Some other feature on the adversary, some environment move that I could make, whether that's from an environment stat block or something that I improvise, or some other move that I could make based on where the story is right now. What would be the most interesting thing as the next thing that's happening? Fazza Curley says, I've been avoiding clearing adversary statuses for a round or two unless they can't act at all. Activating countdown dice is sometimes good. I definitely agree on clearing statuses. I think a good way of being a fan of the character is to let a status hold long enough for at least one, maybe two or more characters to act in a way that takes advantage of that status. And then I maybe would think about clearing it. Countdowns are definitely a good option. It's a way of signaling future trouble, right? Some adversary or environment features will have countdowns. Starting a countdown is might be a good failure with hope move where you're gesturing toward a future danger. GH Leo says, good ideas on amping up the dynamics. Are there some tips on reducing the battle's intensity? That is a great question. If the antagonists in the scene want something other than or beyond just knocking out or killing the PCs, you can make a move that is those antagonists appealing to the PCs for whatever that thing is. This doesn't have to end in blood. Just give me the gem and everybody can walk away, right? That is a move toward reducing the intensity, right? That could be de-escalation. That is the antagonist giving the player characters an out. Now, maybe they won't take it, but we're telling a story together, right? Sometimes the character's motivation will mean that they're going to give up the gem rather than see one of the player characters get attacked again and have to make a death move, right? If we're thinking about telling the story together, antagonists, not every antagonist is just going to attack until everybody is dead, right? Especially an antagonist who has like a mixed relationship to the PCs, right? Where they have conflict over their motivations or their objectives, but they have some affection for each other, right? That's a great place for the antagonists to try to de-escalate. You might also reduce intensity by making a softer move and kind of slowing down your press against the PCs. In a big fight or a scene that I want to be kind of to feel scary, I tend to come out of the gate pretty strong, right? Cool, we're entering this scene of conflict. I've got antagonists who are going to start attacking, and I've got 7 fear. The first time I get to go, I might activate every antagonist I have, every adversary I have, or at least activate like 3 or 4 of them. Or maybe I take some of the other guidance from the book and I just keep spotlighting adversaries until at least somebody hits, right? Try to draw blood to make that threat real. But then if somebody rolls a failure with hope, I might take that as an opportunity to build suspense rather than immediately escalating danger. I might cut to some part of the scene and say, hey, I'm going to start a countdown to something happening. Or I can try to de-escalate. Or I can zoom in and slow down and focus on the emotion, right? I might reduce the battle's intensity by shifting my focus to an individual player character's emotional landscape, where the existing intensity then becomes more personal. And so we're zooming in. And maybe that doesn't make the overall scene more intense, but it does create some variety in how the scene feels because we're really zooming in on one person and one person's emotional experience of the situation rather than the kind of like wide shot of here's what's happening in the fight scene overall, and then we go into, you know, medium shots or close shots for the individual attacks if we're using kind of the cinematic language. Those are a couple of things for reducing intensity. Another thing I might do for reducing intensity is by contrast, right? If on a failure with fear, I go pretty hard and then use 3 or so fear to activate and spotlight additional adversaries, I can reduce intensity by the next time somebody rolls a success with fear or something else that prompts a move, I just make the one move. I don't also spend fear for additional moves. Or I use a move that is less dangerous, right? I use a standard attack from an adversary instead of a special attack that's a feature that requires them spending stress or marking stress or using a feature where I have to spend fear, right? Those are escalatory. The more resources I use, the higher intensity the move I'm making is probably going to be. So I can reduce intensity by returning or recalibrating or resetting the kind of intensity average of the scene back toward a more like a lower stakes or just even a lower intensity attack, right? I did this big scary attack where I spend fear and it made a big impact. And then a couple of PCs went, and then it comes back to me on a failure with hope. I can lower the relative intensity by maybe just repositioning an adversary instead of making an attack, or making a standard attack instead of one of the more special attacks. Because if you only ever use the special attack, is it special anymore? Right? It might feel less special because it's just this is what they're using. So you can vary intensity just within how one adversary behaves. Okay. So we've already talked some with varying intensity. I talked about coming out swinging. What I like in doing this to kind of explain my thinking a little bit more is if I come out swinging, I give each adversary a chance to take the spotlight and show what they can do and to characterize them some. And if I make, 4 or 5 moves, spending, 3 to 5 fear, depending on, 3 to 6 fear, depending on how I'm doing it, right? If we open a fight, but I feel like I need to spend a fear to take the spotlight, I might end up with 6 because it's 1 to take the spotlight and then others for fear and things like that. Anyway, going hard at the beginning of the scene can put the player characters on the back foot and communicate to them, oh wow, this is really like this is a real threat, a real danger. And if you're using a bunch of different adversaries, you go, oh man, if we roll a failure with fear, they've got enough fear left. They could just focus down and like make somebody make a death move. This is really dangerous. We need to think smart here. And then once I have made the threat real, I might back off a little bit and create the opportunity for the player characters to then push back and change the dynamic of the fight, right? I've swung it this way to start, and then depending on what the scene is meant to do, I can offer more or less resistance as they turn the tide the other way. Fazak Early says, I ran a combat yesterday where the adversaries wanted to take the players alive. That was a dance in raising and lowering intensity. Yeah, right? Again, we can come back to the idea of motivation and objective as a way of making sure that our fights are interesting and don't end up feeling like, fight 75 of 300. What was that scene about? That was a scene about the adversaries wanting to capture the PCs, right? And so the way they attacked, the way that they talked, the way that they moved within the scene was different than here is the third time we fought bandits who just want to knock us out and take our money, or maybe kill us and take our money. If we think about motivation and objectives, right? Begin and end with the fiction. In the fiction, these people have their own motivations. They have their hopes and fears. And if we think as GMs, starting from that perspective regarding these antagonists, these adversaries as actors within the fiction, then that can put us on a good path. Magdalena says, I've noticed team-ups tend to be pivotal or game-changing in action combat scenes. Do you have any ideas for subtly suggesting to players that it might be a good time to team up? That is a great question. And I agree that like team-ups and tag teams can be a great way to swing the fight. Sometimes I am as overt as reminding the player characters, hey, remember, you can do a tag team action, and if you do tag team to attack and you succeed, both of you roll damage and you add it together. So that's a great way to be able to hit a tougher enemy for more hit points. If I'm kind of teaching Daggerheart, or if this is an early game within a campaign, I might be more overt about it, because folks might still be learning the rules. If it's later on in a campaign where I feel like being more subtle, I might more overtly state, yeah, I'm sorry, that falls short of their severe threshold, so they're only going to take major damage. And then the player can go, wait a second, that was about as high as I can roll on damage. So unless I get a crit, maybe I can't do severe damage. And then they might go looking for options. And one of those options to increase your damage is tag teams. The Kids Are Asleep says, love tag teams. They appeal to my JRPG impulses, lol. Absolutely, right? There's a great cutscene in Act 2 of Clair Obscur Expedition 33 that in my heart is just a set of tag team attacks, right? That's how I think about it in my head because I'm a geek like that. There's also a sequence in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, not remake, Rebirth, that is like, what if each character in the party does a tag team that then creates a chain? It's so fun. It's a great narrative move because it shows it can show the relationship between characters. It is right. It's a way of the players escalating. It's a great moment to zoom in on. The Kids Are Asleep mentions Chrono Trigger for the team up attacks. Absolutely. GH Lello, I am also a big fan of Exalted. I still have most of my Exalted books. You can actually see them back here, right? I think that's the main book. I haven't looked at those in a while. I haven't got to play a lot of really high level Daggerheart. I'm curious how much high level Daggerheart could feel like Exalted. How much, could I, for my own table, build like an Exalted campaign frame? What would it take to make Daggerheart feel like Exalted? Right? Would I need to like change how domains work? Would it just be a question of focusing on high level play? It is something I have thought about before, and we'll probably come back to. Yeah, I haven't played Exalted in quite some time, Prince Justin. I have the 3rd edition book and I have Essence, but I have not gotten to play either of them. Not just yet. Okay. Looking back within my notes, we've talked some about thinking in beats, but I want to underscore that a little bit more, right? A scene is maybe more memorable if, when you're thinking back on it, you can identify the turning points in that scene, right? One of the way you could start that out by like the GM comes on really strong. And so the first big moment that the players remember from that scene is, and there were so many of them and they were doing all these special attacks and I got hit twice and I had to mark 5 HP. So I got hit twice and I used armor. So I had 3 HP marked and 2 of my armor marked right away. And I only have 4 armor total, right? And they're thinking about the mechanical application, or maybe they're thinking about the fiction of the description of how they got hit a couple of times. And that creates that first turning point, right? The beginning state or the first major turning point in the scene was we are losing, right? Or we are under a lot of pressure, right? A beat of escalation, right? That might be when an adversary uses one of their more powerful moves, or when a countdown triggers, there might be escalation. You might escalate using an environment feature. I'm going to mention it here, and I might come back to it again later. Another escalation, and this guidance is in the Daggerheart core book, is phase changes, right? And so this, for me, I'm inspired when I think about phase changes by like Dark Souls or other video games where like you have multi-phase bosses, right? It's like, yes, cool. I got the enemy's health bar down to 0. Why haven't I gotten the U1 thing, right? The achievement or whatever. And then the adversary does something to change the terms of the fight, right? They take out a new weapon. They transform into a new form. They take the fight to another location. They might throw off their armor and become way fast, right? There's a boss in Lies of P. It's kind of like a Bloodborne alike, right? But with Pinocchio. It's surprisingly great. When I first saw like previews for it, I was not impressed. Actually, a really fun game. One of my favorites of its year. I'm currently playing Overture, which is the DLC that is a prequel. Still very fun, right? So in FromSoft or like Soulsborne games, when there's a phase change, the adversary almost always changes some of their behavior, right? They have new attacks, or their weapon changes, or their physical form changes, so that the part of the fight after the phase change just feels different than before. Before contribute to totem. Is that one of my bits options? That's great. I don't remember putting that there. Thank you so much for the contribution. That's very funny. So here, the countdown cult totem was at 5 of 6, and now cult totem is at 3 of 6. Right? I'm ticking the countdown. What happens when this countdown triggers? Who knows? We'll have to play to find out. So thank you, Magdalena. Phase changes are really cool, right? Because I like the video games that utilize those. But it is a way of both escalating and changing the terms of the fight, right? If your phase change for an adversary is that they had been doing ranged attacks and now they're doing melee attacks, well, that changes where the player characters maybe want to be. If everybody was kind of bunched up to be able to, for the Guardian to be able to protect the group from ranged attacks, and then the adversary does a phase change and they pull out a giant sword and you start doing area of effect melee attacks, you might then cause the player characters to scatter because they don't want to have everybody be attacked at the same time by a single roll. There's good examples of this kind of melee AoE, in the Age of Umbra, like the series that Critical Role is doing on the Critical Role channel, right? Matt, the GM, has had some big nasty adversaries that can make AoE melee attacks. Everybody within very close range, or everybody within close range, which is huge. And if with one move he's getting to attack 5 or 7 PCs, that can create so much pressure. So you can learn from that, right? Think about changing an adversary to, from range to melee, or if they had been melee, what in the fiction could they be doing different that would let them threaten the PCs in a different way, right? Do they start swinging wildly where their attack bonus goes down, but they get to attack at an AoE? Or do you give them the ramp up feature when they have a phase change where you have to spend a fear to activate them, but they attack everybody in, within melee, everyone within very close, whatever. When I'm designing phase changes for like when I'm running fights, I try to think about how is this person or how is this being changing? How can I describe their transformation? And then how would that apply in features and their other like traits and like numbers and things? Okay, this adversary had a passive feature that reduced damage they took, and their difficulty was pretty high. But then when they have a phase change, they throw off their armor, and now they're really fast, right? So they go from Relentless 2 to Relentless 4. 4 is a lot, right? But maybe they go from Relentless 2 to Relentless 3, and when they make a melee attack, they can target 2 targets within range, right? They kind of automatically get the quick feature every time. That makes sense in the fiction. I might pair that with their damage thresholds go down, or I get rid of that damage reduction passive, and or I make their difficulty lower, right? They are faster, but they're easier to hurt. Maybe they're not easier to hit, so I don't lower difficulty, but I do lower the damage thresholds, or I take away that damage reducing feature, right? I want how they are different in the fiction to reflect and indicate what is different about them mechanically. And then when I use them, those mechanical manifestations should reflect what I described in the fiction. You can also do a phase change in the environment. There is one environment phase change in the core book, right? Castle Siege can become, I think, pitched battle or open battle. I don't remember the final name that the book ended up with, right? But at a certain point, a siege can become, you're just storming the castle and everybody's fighting within the castle. You can have phase changes for your environments, right? One environment changing to another, or you might have a state change within an environment, right? You have a countdown, and when that countdown triggers, something applies, right? How can you make the whole feeling of the scene change, either by a character changing how they interact with the scene, or by this, the surroundings changing, or the characters move surroundings, right? In fighting games, right? Sometimes between bouts, one of the characters will like knock everybody through the floor, and then you fall to another level and everything looks different, right? You could do that in Daggerheart, depending on the tone for your game, right? Maybe you can do that in Daggerheart, especially at higher tiers, right? You're fighting in the Hollows above, and you're fighting against a high seraph who has been convinced that the earth needs to be destroyed so that the perfect creation of the gods is no longer marred by the frailties of humanoids. And so you're fighting a high seraph up in the Hallows, right? And you fight and you fight and fight, and then you say that the seraph grabs somebody, flies up with them, and then body slams them into the floor, and it hits the floor so hard that the tile floor shatters and everybody drops down to a lower level within the temple, right? Maybe it's a little silly, but maybe it's just awesome. Changing the environment can also be like, hey, this fight scene has become a chase, and so you're no longer in the environment you were in. Now we're in a new environment, whether we're using an environment stat block to like represent the chase itself, or you're moving from where you were and to go, oh, okay, well, now this other environment applies to where you are because you've left this, you've left the ballroom, and now you're just running through the city streets. And so a different environmental passive is going to apply here, or something like that. I talked some about softer moves on Failure with Hope. POV of that moment, you have to choose between a boon for being next to an ally or synergy, or setting up for being hit with an AoE. Absolutely, Leo, yeah. When the spotlight passes back to the players, if they move, but the only thing they do is move, as I remember and interpret the book, it says, hey, that means you're probably going to call for a roll, just because moving around within a dangerous situation has uncertainty. If you move and make do something that has an action roll, that uncertainty is folded into that action. But if you're running a wrecking ball into the player characters and everybody wants to scatter, well, what are they doing with the scatter? If the only thing they're doing is try to get out of the way, then maybe you're going to ask for a roll that represents, can they get away from this kind of juggernaut of an enemy? Or as they're trying to pull away, do they get attacked? Or does some other adversary move to intercept them? Right? Then you can use certain types of adversaries, right? Like bruisers can be especially good for this. Put a bruiser into a group of player characters and see whether they scatter. And then if they do, right, you can either respond to that, or you can have some other adversary and react to it, or something like that. Fazakerly also contributes to Cult's Totem. Thank you so much for that. That is going to be another Cult Totem 1 of 6. So I guess I've established the rule that 250 channel points is one tick on the Cult Totem. I genuinely don't remember where this comes from, but I will do something funny if we complete the countdown. Okay. Looking at my notes. Controlling pacing is like the next, one of the last big things that I have. We've talked some about using countdowns, right? Countdowns can be an adversary is winding up to do something big. A countdown could be this cultist is trying to summon a demon during the fight. A countdown could be an NPC has been knocked into the water, and when this countdown triggers, I'm going to start marking HP on them, right? So you try and go and save them before they drown. Countdowns are really versatile, right? Countdowns I think of as being pretty coterminous with clocks from Blaze in the Dark and Apocalypse World and things like that. You can also have, right, sometimes you have countdowns and loop countdowns on adversaries that like are the recharge for like a fire breath or something. But that also creates its own sense of timing and pacing within the fight of like, the dragon's breath countdown is down to 2. So maybe we want to try to start separating from one another so that we don't all get hit by the breath when it does finally trigger. A bunch of different things you can do with countdowns, which are great. In terms of dynamic fights, right? Other techniques, make sure that the antagonists are fighting smart. Some of the antagonist kind of groups in the book, like the Jagged Knife bandits or the cultists or some other ones, they have elements in their design that are intentionally that are synergistic, right? This adversary makes a target vulnerable. This other adversary from that same group does double damage to a target that is vulnerable. That's a combo. Make them vulnerable, hit them really hard. That represents and expresses the teamwork and the synergy between those antagonists. So if you are building a fight, you can pick adversaries that have that combo built in, or you can pick adversaries that complement each other and generate a combo, even if they weren't from like the same pseudo faction. Or you improvise some feature or some move that sets up or exploits something that's already in the scene, right? Oh, this adversary did something to make a PC vulnerable. It makes sense in the fiction, and I'm going to go ahead and go hard here to do something that's going to capitalize on that vulnerability. This is also just like Keith Amman, The Monsters Know What They're Doing, right? Keith is the author of the blog and now the book, The Monsters Know What They're Doing. And then there's other books kind of in that same vein that are like kind of strategy for playing as the monsters or antagonists in like a fantasy action story. Another trick you can do to set the terms or change the terms of a fight is use or improvise a feature that changes the character's hope die or fear die. There are several examples of this in the core book, right? The cult ritual environment has a feature that reduces the player character's hope die in size. Some of the emotion demons have features that will change the hope die or fear die, right? The demon of wrath can increase the player character's fear die, where they're more likely to succeed, but also more likely to generate fear, right? So there's an upside downside. And then some features are really nasty where they're just like, and your fear and your hope die is smaller. And that's just rough. So GH Leo has contributed to Cult Totem again, Cult Totem 0 of 6. And what should I do with that? So we have trying to figure out ways that I can do fun things that I can do. Because that hits the goal, right? And what are we going to do? I'm trying to remember where the tool is to just like do funny things. But here's what I will do. I can't promise that it will be this week, but I had already been thinking about something. And so what I'll do here is I'm going to announce a new stream sub-series. I was thinking that because there's a lot of attention on Daggerheart, and I'm very excited about Daggerheart, but in the core book of Daggerheart, there's a lot of discussion about inspiration and influences and touchstones, right? Daggerheart doesn't exist without the whole team playing a bunch of different games and taking influence from a bunch of different places, right? So many games build on what other games have already done. So none of us are in this alone. What I'd love to do with some of the additional kind of attention that I've been getting doing streams about Daggerheart is I want to share the love. And so this is going to be a stream series called Sharing Spotlight. And the idea is that I want to spotlight some other RPGs that may not be as well known to folks that are either starting with Daggerheart or coming to Daggerheart as like a second or third game, or maybe just games that are not as well known overall. And I have done some streams looking at or like doing a quick read through of various RPGs, and doing stuff like that was part of how I ended up where I am, having worked on Daggerheart. But what I can do with Sharing Spotlight is take some of this extra attention and give some love to games that could use extra eyes, that I think do something really cool and specific, right? Where no one game should have to be everything to everybody. I am a happier person when I am getting to play and run a variety of different games and figuring out and learning what different games are interested in and what different games can do. And so the completion of the cult totem, I guess this is going to be the cult of Sharing Spotlight, is one way of thinking about it. That probably not this week, but hopefully next week I will do this might be shorter. It's going to be, it would be a second stream of the week, right? It wouldn't be the main stream, but a stream that is starting the Sharing Spotlight sub-series and talking about an RPG that I want to give some spotlight to and talk about why I think it's interesting and folks should check it out. So that way, right, Daggerheart's success can be a rising tide that lifts other boats, right? One thing that I don't want is a TTRPG ecosystem where there's only one big game. Because I think people are going to have more fun and there's more opportunities for more creators when it is a more diverse field, both in like a inclusion standpoint, but in terms of styles of design and types of games. And I want people to be able to find the games that will help them have the kind of fun that they want to have. I think Daggerheart is a great game for having certain types of fun, and those types of fun are like a lot of the types of fun I like having. And I'm really glad that a bunch of people have connected with the game and said, oh, this has let me have so much fun in the way that I like having fun. And that's all really good. And I want to be able to build on that some with my own, like from my own perspective, with the platform that I have as an individual. So that's what we're going to do. Thank you again to Magmalena, Fazakerly, and GH Leo for your contributions toward the cult totem, which has now become something. And so we'll get that next week, as long schedule and life permitting, right? Something might come up, but because of this, I'm going to put that on my schedule. So I'll figure out what game I want to talk about and then try to flag it so that folks know when it's coming up, because it won't be the Wednesday stream, right? It'll be some other day in the week. So that's that. And now we'll return to dynamic combats and Daggerheart, and I will take a last look at my notes. Okay. One of the things that somebody asked about was ending strong, right? Or like not having having a fight just kind of like carry on. So a few things. Remembering motivation. There's a lot of reasons why people might not want to fight to the death, right? In a Learn to Play series that I ran in the last month, there was a bandit attack against the player characters. And once it was clear the player characters were kind of had control of the situation, one of the player characters said, I want to convince everybody to stop fighting, described how he was going to do this, made a presence roll, did a great job, right? Got a really high result. And so thinking about the motivation of those bandits, I said, yeah, they don't want to die, right? They just got hired to do a job. The thing that they know how to do is hurt people and intimidate people and take their money. They can try to hurt the PCs, but they're not doing it fast enough. They haven't succeeded in intimidating the PCs, and they don't want to die for this. So the fight turned into a tense negotiation because the PCs wanted information, and the bandits had been hired by the actual big bad. The scene turned on a dime because the right action at the right time got a good result. I thought about motivation. I thought about how the scene was going, and I decided that it was more interesting to focus on the negotiation part than to have the bandits all fight to the death, right? Animals might not fight to the death unless they're cornered. Humans and human-type people often don't fight to the death unless they're really forced to. So an enemy might run away. An enemy might sue for peace. An enemy might give up on the thing that they're trying to do, right? If they were attacking to try to accomplish something, they might give up and try to accomplish it another way, or right? They back off for now and then come back when the PCs aren't around. Other ways that you can finish a scene are like, especially if I feel like a scene is about to start to drag or maybe starting to drag, I might look at what is happening and then just make the overt ask to the players, hey, I think you all have this in the bag. Do folks want to like play some more of this out, or should we just describe how you dispatch the rest of these adversaries? Right? I have made that move as a GM before, and I think it was the right choice at the time, right? In an action scene, Fazzackerly says something really good, so I'm going to digress real quick to that comment. A bandit leader who runs away becomes a party nemesis 6 months later in the campaign, right? Reincorporation is a really powerful storytelling move because if you bring back a character, that's a character the players already have some emotional investment in, ideally, and the characters are even more likely to have some emotional investment in them. So reusing characters later in the story or in new roles is a great move. And but if the adversaries all die every time, you can't bring them back unless they like come back from the dead, right? In fantasy, you can do this. But Fabula Ultima has a great rule for this, where there's classes of villains, and when the villain is like defeated, one of the things they can do is escalate, right? They make some big decision so that they become a threat on a bigger scale, right? And so this represents like when Kefka escalates or when Sephiroth escalates, and it lets you keep a villain around while still honoring that the player characters have won in a scene. So that's a great option. Fabula Ultima might be a good option for sharing Spotlight. We'll just see. I'm actually going to get to play Fabula Ultima later this week. So stay tuned for more on that, probably. Back to resolutions. Some of the GM advice in Daggerheart includes cut to the action. For me, that also can include wrap a scene when the action is complete, right? When the big moments of the scene are done, we don't need to linger out. We don't need to kind of wrap up everything, right? We can say after, when the skeleton knight's skull topples to the ground, no longer animate, the bleached bones rolling out of the helmet, the other skeletons break. Right? That's the end of the fight. Even if the player characters would like chase down some of the skeletons, the fight is done. If a player says, hey, I want to chase down some of these skeletons and just destroy them entirely, I probably won't call for a roll there, right? Let a scene end once the big moments are done, because I then become more interested in how are the characters going to respond to that scene, right? How are they going to process it? How are they going to talk with each other about it? How are they going to kind of unpack what has happened with one another? I'd rather probably jump ahead to that scene than linger at a moment of lower interest. But that's just me. Prince Justin says, I call it back for Sweeps Week. 100%. Folks who are younger, Sweeps Week is a television thing. I don't know that I can super adequately explain it, but it's another form of reincorporation. So that is us getting to 2:30. So now I am going to look on Twitch to see who else is streaming and see if there is somebody we can send some love to. Is anybody streaming Daggerheart right now? Yes. It looks like there is a group streaming Daggerheart, probably in Spanish. So my Spanish is not great. I will encourage folks to go over to this channel, take a look what they're doing, especially if you are a Spanish speaker / understand Spanish. Something I've been really happy to see is people engaging with Daggerheart in other languages, right? Some translations have been announced, and more people getting to play the game is really fun, and people being able to play the game in their own language and not just having to play in English, right? Because even though English is very widely spoken, it's cooler to be able to play in your own language because that can be more comfortable, right? So I am going to grab the name of this channel, and then we're going to go raid, and we're going to go say hi, and I want everybody to be cool, okay? If you speak Spanish, use Spanish. Otherwise, just say hello, hang out for a bit if you can, and then move on with your day. I am not listening to their audio because that would probably be distracting for me. The tech, like their tech stuff is in Spanish, so I'm guessing they're speaking Spanish. I'm going to go listen to them for a second, just in case. Yeah, I believe that's Spanish. I could be wrong. So, all right, Spada is sword. I don't recall if I know the Spanish for Daggerheart. But anyway, go say hi if you can. I would love for folks to go and show them a little bit of love. Hang out, especially if you know Spanish. Otherwise, that's going to be all for today. I'm going to be back next week with another Daggerheart stream, and then hopefully also next week we're going to be starting sharing Spotlight. This video will be on YouTube, kind of not too long after this. And then stay tuned to my Patreon at patreon.com/Michael R. Underwood for other essays about gaming and Daggerheart. More specifically, for pictures of my cute dog Oreo. His gotcha day was yesterday, right? So we've had him for 8 years now. He is now a distinguished elder gentleman. Doesn't get us around quite as well as he used to, but he is wonderful, and we're lucky to have him. So you can see some pictures of him there as a paid subscriber. Thank you to everybody who has become a subscriber in the last month or so since Daggerheart has come out, and since I've been doing streams about the game here and talking about it there. It is a great show of support, and I'm really grateful. Grateful to you all who showed up to watch during the stream, and I'm grateful for folks who are watching later on with the VOD or on YouTube. All of your support is very welcome. I'm very grateful for it. And then, as I said before, if you have questions, asking them on YouTube in the comments for this video is probably the best thing for your questions about this topic. Until next time, thanks so much. I'll see you around. Now we're going to go raid.